I'd like to have a class closed or a positive note. I have no idea what he's going to do. He's a very cautious person, and I respect that. One time, I was taking him to a certain place in my car. When we got in the car, he got it in on the passenger side, and he said, "Is there an airbag on this side of the car?" I said, "There is now." Now I get to get Eckstein.
Well, I'm a preacher's kid, and so I'll follow up Bob's comments by actually my mother and father were ordained ministers in the Salvation Army, and the Salvation Army was a social gospel. William Booth founded the Salvation Army because the alcoholics were not allowed in the church. One of my first articles was to compare Maslow's hierarchy to William Booth's slogan, "Soup, Soap, and Salvation." But anyway, as a preacher's kid, I'm allowed to tell a story that the preacher had waxed long and eloquently well beyond the cherished 12 o'clock Sunday hour, for those of you from the Christian model. Somebody get that, Bob? And so what had happened is it was like 12:30, and so everybody was filing out, and the little boy's mother was like, came up to the minister and said, "I'm just filled with the Spirit from your sermon." She poked her son and said, "Go ahead, tell the Reverend how you feel." And he said, "I got a belly full too, Rev." Some people have been filled with the Spirit when I spoke, and other people, I think, have enjoyed as much as they can stand. I would like, I'm just not used to having people so far away, because I like to try to make eye contact. When you nod out, I try to bring you back. Is there any way that you folks can come up any closer?
Sure. Come on, you guys. I know so thoroughly. Thank you. There we go.
And how about here? Here? I am very pleased to be with you tonight. I have brought some guests with me. Tonight we're going to look at reorientation. Reframing is the particular topic of tonight. There is a version of what I'm going to talk to you about in your lifestyle notebooks, but I have an updated version of that, and we'll be talking a bit about that. And I believe we're going to have some handouts that Ev made, but I never always have a backup plan, so I have some of that with me. Let me introduce some of my colleagues and learners from the Capella University. Some of you may be coming tomorrow night, because tomorrow night is really meant to be a linking and a networking between the Capella School. We're over at Northwest College. We've been there for 2 weeks. Capella is an online master's and doctoral program. And so part of that is a 2-week residency right here in Minneapolis. So we've been at Northwest College. I'm a part of the division of counseling psych. I live in Scottsdale, and I will be moving in July to the Adler School in Toronto, taking a position as core faculty there. Very pleased. And we're interested in, I've been here in Minneapolis, done leadership by encouragement, go way back with you folks, and we're looking at doing some collaborative programs together. Particularly, I encourage all of you to think about coaching. I was at the American Psychological Conference in San Francisco in August. They had a symposium on coaching. 350 psychologists came. So the Adler School in Toronto has created 3 one-week seminars. I've been through all 3 of those. And I've also met Patrick Williams. Patrick Williams was in Toronto doing a seminar His book, The Therapist as Life Coach, was recently selected as one of the alternative selections of the Anglo Science Book Club. So I think coaching is an important component for us to think about. There are lots of people that wouldn't go for counseling or therapy, but somehow the idea of coaching is a little more palatable. So tomorrow night, I'll be doing an emphasis on organizations from the perspective of my book, Leadership by Encouragement. And so some of the Capella people will be actually talking a bit more about their program. I am going to ask the Capella folks if they will introduce themselves, and while you do that, I'm going to do the famous family counseling intervention called the bathroom technique. Bathroom technique. I'll walk out and I'll come back.
Hello, Russ Riendo. I'm from Northern Illinois, and I'm one of the doctoral learners at Capella. And I'm in the educational track, and I've been there about a year and a half now. So I have about 5 classes to go, and then comps and dissertations. So I think we're all very similar in that. But it's a great program, and thanks for having us here. Looking forward to it.
I'm Elizabeth Evanston. I am in the clinical doctoral program at Capella. I just finished.
I want to say thanks particularly to this group. They've been going all day long, like most of you that work. They've been in classes now. This is our 2nd week. There was a big talent show tonight, and so they gave up that in order to come here. They don't have a life. They said, I just want more. Right. They were afraid that they would get co-opted into being up there, so thank you. Now, for their benefit and for the idea that review is one form of learning, so I'm going to paint a broad context, understanding these folks, it's the first time they just walked in on the 2nd act here. Let me share with you a little bit about this whole business. I see a big pile of papers in Susie. Great. Thank you, Susie. First of all, it's 30 years ago. Hey, yeah, if you'll just, don't give them out yet, though.
Not yet?
No, just hang on. In fact, give them, yeah, just hang on. Hey, look, if I give them out, then they got the paper, they leave, you know, that's all there is to it. So, yeah. The last year of my doctoral program, 1972, I know that just sounds incredibly long time ago. I came to Chicago and I attended a lifestyle demonstration by Harold Mozak. Harold has been here on this faculty, still is a member of your faculty here. And Rudolph Dreikers was scheduled to have presented, and he got sick and died shortly after that. Dreikers carried on Adler's work. I was so impressed with this whole idea of lifestyle assessment that I wanted to learn more about it. What concerned me is when I went out of the room, most people were going, wasn't he just wonderful? Well, Mozak was great. What I didn't hear people going out going, well, what did he do, and or can I do that? Now, clearly, he was a master clinician. But in the end of my doctoral program, I met with another person, Lee Baruth, who had just graduated with Oscar Christensen from the University of Arizona. And I said, let's put together a workbook. I don't think he was just a great Oz, and did he sprinkle wiffle dust, or what did he do in this whole business of lifestyle? And can we reproduce this? And so the original version came out, Lifestyle, what it is and how to do it. And so we've gone through many versions of that. It was my hope to create an example of an instrument and then some suggested guidelines. It is really, even, and this is your advanced lifestyle course, but I would say that there are books by Mozak, and then the book by Jane Powers and Jane Griffith and Bob Powers, the Psychoclarity Process. I don't know if you had that in other courses or not. But these are excellent clinical examples of lifestyle, of which I reference some of their materials. Let me review for you, well, first of all, for you folks here, and in my own 30 years, I want to mention 3 products, both as a shameless sale, but also as a way of illustrating to me the versatility of what I think Adlerian psychology has been. Recently, I co-authored with the McKays and Steve Mayville a book called Raising Respectful Kids in a Rude World. This takes the classic Adlerian models of family systems and family and child guidance. Systematic Training for Effective Parenting is a video-based program. 5 million copies have been sold to date. The Adlerian psychology movement has done a lot in classroom discipline and a lot in parent education. Adler is considered one of the founders of the group movement. George Gaza, in his classic book on groups, credits Adler with counseling families in front of other families. And at the end, in the middle of that, he would ask how many have had a similar problem. Maybe 80% of the hands would raise. First of all, he felt rather than it being shameful, it was encouraging to begin to feel a commonality in the community that my problems weren't unique to me as a family. How many people in individual therapy feel that way? I'm the only one. So Adler would ask other members of the audience, how many of you have had a similar problem? A lot of hands would go up, and then he would ask, and what did some of you do? So he used the group in a problem-solving way. So we originally wrote about nonviolence, and the author said, well, we just turned down 11 manuscripts, the publishers. But Prima Publishers has done a lot of Jane Nelson, Lynn Watts, and they said, we've had a title, this is the title we would like you to write from an Adlerian perspective. The Adlerian family systems, Adler was one of the, again, systems approach. And so leadership by encouragement really took the Adlerian ideas and related them in an organization setting. And so that's what we'll be looking at tomorrow. And then, of course, from your perspective, the counseling and clinical part of an Adlerian is lifestyle. So let's just review for a moment the 4 developmental stages in an Adlerian therapeutic intervention. Developing the relationship is that of collegial. So where we're going to lead to tonight is very much based on this whole sense that just like we believe in the horizontal plane, and it's not the all-knowing therapist, and it's not the all-going Oz, what I want to say is when we come to the reinterpretation and the reorientation, as much as possible, we want some of those insights to come from our client. Because whenever a person discovers a truth for himself or herself, the psychological ownership is obviously much higher. So I want to say that as we look at the second phase, which is the investigation. So we develop a relationship of rapport, of collegial, peers, in terms of equal respect and dignity. Then we go through this tool, which is one tool, and that's the lifestyle assessment. Many other places can use it as a psychosocial. You folks have been using it as a counseling tool intervention, which leads to phase 3 after the investigation is that interpretation phase. And that's what you folks have done. You've all written up lifestyles. And that leads us to the 4th phase, reorientation. And so our focus tonight is going to look at a little bit about this whole business of change, particularly from the perspective of reframing. And there is an earlier version of what I'm going to do for you tonight that's in your book that I did in New Zealand last year. And I'm going to be doing a program at the Wellness Conference in Chicago next month. And so this is an updated version of what's in your notebook. But let's just, before I get into reframing, let's just talk a little bit about this whole business of change. And I'm going to talk about a few models and techniques that I'd like to suggest to you. First of all, I want to talk about Kurt Lewin, and I want to bring in some industrial organizational principles. Kurt Lewin did a lot with change, and he's basically said there's a developmental process of change. He said the first thing is that people are frozen. What are we frozen? We're frozen by our habitual ways of doing things. Our unconscious, our unaware habits. Now, just let me give you a practical example of just how conditioned we are, and we're often not even aware of it. Alongside my bed in Scottsdale, I had on a dresser right on the parallel with my bed, there was a clock there. Well, the problem I had with this clock was when I had pillows beside me, I could never see the clock. But for a year, I'd never made any problem-solving approaches. Finally, one day, Fortunately, it fell off, it broke, so I had to get a new one. And this shattered my usual pattern, and so I thought, well, now, you know what, I'll do something really innovative. I'll put the clock up on the top of the headboard so I can see it. That's simple enough. 1 year later, in the middle of the night, when I wake up, I still look over to the bedstand. Simple but profound example of how habitual had been my behavior, how conditioned was I. And so Lewin says, in terms of change, first of all, we're frozen. And so one of the first steps of change, he says, we got to unfreeze. Now, there are dramatic ways of unfreezing, and reframing is a mild one. But let me give you some examples on a more dramatic nature. Tony Robbins is a lot of you have seen Tony Robbins, Unlimited Power. He did the Firewalks many years ago. He's a colorful character. He's got a series of tapes out on personal power. Tony Robbins right now, for 1 hour of his time as a consultant, $1 million. $1 million. So whether or not you like Tony Robbins, somebody that gets $1 million an hour, I want to learn a little bit, just a little bit maybe, about what they do. The last 3 presidents have hired Tony Robbins. The last 3 Soviet prime ministers have all spent 1 hour with Tony Robbins. So, one of the things that he says in terms of being frozen, I'll give you a couple of his points. Because one way we unfreeze is therapeutically we want to change the state. And one of the things he confronts us as therapists is that too often what happens is we reinforce this like learned helplessness. Now, how do we do that? One of what I think was my contributions to the lifestyle literature, not only did I hopefully create a structured instrument, but in the 96 version, I was trained classically, like many of you, whether you do a lifestyle or not, but when I was trained to, like most therapists, the very first words out of my mouth were, tell me your symptoms. What's wrong? Well, first of all, Robbins says, if you think about first impressions, what do you think that communicates as of what's important in therapy? Symptoms, psychopathology, positive psychology, with no reference to Adler, by the way, and I am passionately interested in it. Even Mozak mentioned this year. I want to get involved with that organization because they've all acted like we just invented this whole idea called you build on strengths and not on weaknesses. Some of you hopefully may remember somebody very dear to a lot of your hearts said a long time ago, that's the primary part and why encouragement is such a core of Adlerian theory. Stay with me now with Tony Robbins and his idea of state. So what I want you to imagine that what happens, we okay be moving around like this? All right, good, thank you. Imagine that when we come into therapy, the person, first of all, sits down, and the first thing most of our clients do is they just slump over. Physiologically, the process of slumping over completely constricts your diaphragm, completely constricts breathing. And so then what happens, from the Jewish perspective, there's a great word called kvetch. Oh, what a week I have had. And so we've been in our counseling courses and we heard it's important for the client to tell his or her story. And so we sit and we listen and people slump over and then they start into their story. Oh, what a week I've had. And on Monday, and we're going, I'm listening, and this is really helpful. I want to propose to you that that's not necessarily true. As a matter of fact, I want you to consider the idea of collusion. Collusion is what happens in the family, and those of you that are in the family system, there's a classic family koan or proverb called the pink elephant on the floor. You come in as a family therapist, and you're sitting in the room there, and there's a pink elephant, and nobody is acknowledging there's a pink elephant. The pink elephant may be dad's alcoholism, or the abuse that's occurring that nobody wants to speak about. It's certainly clear to you, but the family has colluded to act like there's no pink elephant there. To the extent that we also don't acknowledge there's a pink elephant, that's called collusion. So collusion, I want you to think about. When we sit and listen and a person kvetches and kvetches, we're often reinforcing frozenness. We are reinforcing learned helplessness from Seligman's phrase. This is not, in the grand scheme of things, uplifting in the long run. So the example I wanted to give you with Tony Robbins was two things. One is he had a case where he has an 18-year-old boy that's been brought in because he can't spell well, and his parent, and Robbins lives in La Jolla in Southern California. And so what, basically, the kid comes in and sits down, and sure enough, slumps over, and Tony starts up, "Do you know why you're here?" "Oh man, even further." "Yes." "Why are you here?" "Well, I don't do well in school." "What do you mean you don't? I don't make good grades." Notice, collapsed over. That's what Kurt Lewin would say, frozen. It's frozen. So what does he do? To unfreeze, he changes the state. So he says, what do you do that's fun? Well, the first thing is the kid that was slumped over, he first of all made eye contact for the first time. Moved his chest back, allows him to breathe, to oxygenate, and he says, "I like to surf." And Tony Robbins says, "Well, what do you mean? What's it like for you? I don't surf myself. What's it like for your surfing?" He goes, "Oh man, that's the most incredible thing in the world. I'm out there on the waves and I catch one and it's phenomenal." And he says, "How do you spell so-and-so?" And this kid just goes, "Woo," grabs it right off. "And how do you spell so-and-so?" "Woo." He changed the state. When he changed the state, all of a sudden there was new availability of resources. So I want to come back to another example. Tony Robbins does a workshop on unlimited power. A woman comes up afterwards and, "Oh, Dr. Robbins, I'm going through a divorce. It's so painful and there's no way I could possibly be powerful because it's just so horrible and I feel miserable." He took a glass of water and he threw it in her face. And she's like, "What in the world? Are you out of your mind?" He goes, "Do you know that when you start into that, you're like a robot. You have absolutely robotically conditioned yourself." So I want to propose to you that even though we read in the literature about the client telling his or her story, there's also a little caveat that says, first of all, the truth is they've told it 150 times. And most of the time, they're telling it to you in a robotic state. They could be saying it in their sleep. And I want to propose to you that this, in the long run, does not make for change. Because in a sense, what we've done is we're reinforcing the very frozenness. So, let's go back to Kurt Lewin's model. We're frozen, and the change step is to do something to unfreeze that. In our model, it's to do an intervention. It's to say, let's do this technique, and let's look at this thing, and then we want to maybe see things differently. So we unfreeze, and then the third phase of change from Lewin's idea is we then put in a new program. Or maybe computers, since we got an online program here, and life is full of great ironies, not the least of which is that I teach an online course. Since basically I'm pretty basic with the computer part, but I know this much, right? We got the old Norton virus detector, right? And every couple of weeks you go through and you scan it. And it's a really neat thing, because every once in a while it like catches something and it goes, whoop, it just took whatever it was and said, contaminated, and we're going to just go put this off to the side. So in a sense, Lewin's model would be, we're frozen where you want to unfreeze, but then we want to put in a new program. So that's basically cleaning your hard drive. And then we refreeze that. So that's Kurt Lewin and a model of change. We're frozen. We need to do something to unfreeze. We refreeze that, and we put in a new program, and then we refreeze that. Now, the other model that I want you to consider is in your book briefly, and it's called force field analysis. It's the other model of change Lewin made. This is all background to this. How do we make interventions? I use force field analysis a lot. Lewin basically said change, and that's what reorientation is where we're trying to we're trying to change the hard drive. We're trying to clean up the disk that has gotten viruses. And so reorientation is this idea of saying, how do we go about making change? And the idea that I want you to consider here from Kurt Lewin's perspective is force field analysis. And basically Lewin said, change is a mathematical formula. He said, anytime you consider change, there's a series of driving forces which say yes to that change. And there's also a series of restraining forces which say no. And if you make a change, some of you, every one of you who decided to come to either Capella or the Adler School, for whatever reason, the driving forces, by definition, outweigh the restraining forces. As in, that's why you're here. Some of you went through a divorce. And when you went through the divorce, there were restraining factors, which said something like, we need to stay together for the kids, perhaps. Or, I made a vow when we were married. Some of you still may remember those words that have gotten kind of antiquated, but till death do us part. Well, many of us died a lot sooner than we thought we were. Because we parted much before the death, although the death of the relationship happened. So, the restraining forces would have been things like that. And financial ramifications. We know that despite a divorce, women still in our culture, who often then end up with the kids, are financially strapped often. And so many people stay in a marriage that's less than fulfilling simply because the restraining forces outweigh the driving forces. Conflict, Lewin said, is operationally defined as when the yeses and nos are like 51-49. And then you're really, oh my, and how many of you use those terms? I'm really torn. Which, by the way, is a great time for a Gestalt intervention. Please don't tell the people that I said something about Gestalt. I think I, as a therapist, the term integrative psychologist is not just a concept. I think, for me, Adlerian is my preferred model of choice, and yet it ain't the only game in town. And I use Gestalt an awful lot, especially when I hear somebody go something like either or. Polarities, that's what Gestalt is wonderful at. So that's what I want you to think about when we consider change, a mathematical concept. And so when we think about change, so another way to look at change would be this idea of resistance. And we like to think about resistance in a little more encouraging way in the Adlerian model. Typically we define resistance as unalignment of goals. Or, in other words, I want the person to do something and they don't want to do that. And we too often blame that on resistance. Just a little insider story for those of you future therapists. I'll tell you a little secret of the trade. Take credit for all client successes and blame all client failures on client resistance. Let you know that's the insider story. Now, so I want you to consider in resistance. What's happening is, again, the mathematical part of that is the restraining forces and fear and hope are two great ways of characterizing that. Any of you done the Course in Miracles? Course in Miracles basically says there's really two basic emotions, love and fear. Love, if we translated that loosely, moves me toward, fears constricts. Hopes, fears. One of the greatest Gestalt interventions, when I start working with couples and often with individuals, I start sessions by this way. What's the best thing that could happen for you in our session today? And what's the worst thing that could happen? That's a very simple way to get a force field analysis. Because what that person has told me when they answer that, it's a great quick assessment tool. They told me their hopes, they told me their fears. So when we come to reorientation, I want you to consider Kurt Lewin's model that simply says, I'm not going to change until restraining forces are somehow outweighed by driving forces. So force field analysis is a structured way where you actually have, on a visual way, you list what are all the things that say yes, What are all the things that say no? It's not just a matter of counting them up, because you also give it valiance, right? On a 1 to 10 scale, how important is this? I was in Saudi Arabia 2 years ago. Leadership by Encouragement took me for 21 days into that culture. Very powerful experience for me. And I was doing a force field analysis demonstration, and basically this was a manager, and a great experience for me to both get outside my culture, but also I teach in a business. So as a psychologist, it's really a great experience because, you know, they don't care diddly about theories. They're very much interested in problem solving, how do we get along better, and of course, how do we make better profits? So here's this guy, and his presenting problem was, he was the branch manager, and he was spending hours and hours. He was wedded to his job. And he had two adolescent, he had a pre-adolescent boy and an adolescent female and a girl. And he was not, they were growing up, and he had lost touch with them, like a lot of fathers had done. And so his concern was, I'd really like to spend more time at home with my kids. His restraining forces were, well, but I'm the branch manager. If I start taking time off, how can I expect all these other workers underneath me to be there all the time when they're supposed to be? I got to set an example. Well, I attempted to reframe that right off the bat. I said, well, maybe that'd be a good thing if we think of modeling and imitation. You know what might be a good thing for you to model to them is taking some time off. No, he wasn't convinced on that because he was sure that's what he was supposed to do, is to be a set an example. And so we must have had half a dozen of all the restraining forces. Let me tell you his major driving force, called health. He had just gone for a physical. His blood pressure was off the charts. His doctor had said, you better do something or you're in deep trouble. So he really only had one driving force of all those lists. We had 1 for and 10 against. That one driving force got his attention. So the valiance of his health transcended all those other things. And the only reason he was willing to make that change was that it was being driven by his health. So you understand that making change isn't just a matter of counting up how many yeses and nos. It's also relative valiance. Now all of this I'm attempting to give you a backdrop around which what I believe reorientation or change occurs. That's our point. And so force field analysis is a way. Now, in force field analysis, let me also say that when I generate the data, I don't just passively, quote, accept that client's version of what that is. Now, I don't mean I manipulate that client, but let's say that person really wants to make the change, but the fears are outweighing the hopes. So there's a technique we call sweetening the pot. You heard that before in any of your other classes? Sweetening the pot is where I actively attempt to maybe, Adler said if you're eating a bowl of soup and somebody comes along and spits in it, you can keep eating the soup, it won't be near as pleasurable. That's called spitting in the soup. I grew up in Texas, and my brothers and sisters, I was a firstborn, have a Coke. My mother says, share it with your brothers. I don't know how they did it, but they always had a pack of Nab crackers in their mouth when I give them the Coke. They hand me back the Coke. I don't know about you, we called it backwash. Right? Little cracker crumbs floating in the Coke. The meaning of the Coca-Cola changed dramatically. Stroke and spit are in your book. I think they're two of the most important counselor skills in general, certainly from the Adlerian perspective. Stroking is we build on strengths, we find those areas of encouragement, and spitting in the soup is we confront. So, back to force field analysis. We've done the force field analysis, and the person goes, no way, I can't do it. So sweetening the pot, let me give an example that Tom Allen, who wrote a lot about Adlerian stuff in the early 70s, I got this term from him. And the example he gives is a 30-year-old male who is still living at home with his mom, and he comes to therapy and he says, I want to start dating, but I've been too afraid. And my mother, nobody that I date is acceptable enough anyway, and my mother disapproves of everybody. And so what the sweetening the pot intervention was the next time that you find yourself wanting to ask a woman out for a date and you don't, imagine a great big smile coming across your mother's face because her little boy is still going to stay and be at home and not leave. You know, this was not pleasant to him. This was the equivalent of handing a Coca-Cola back with Cracker Crunch. So in a sense, the point I want you to see is the counselor moved around, and this is the idea that we say of turning a perceived minus into a plus. And so in reorientation, we actively work with the person to help them overcome some of those barriers and perhaps to help them move from the fears to the hopes. Can anybody else just think of an example of something that either you did as a therapist or that someone did to help a person move from a perceived deficiency or from a fear to help them somehow either have the courage or to help find somewhere within them the ability to make that change? Anybody got an example in your own life? Can you think of something? Can you think of something that someone did in your own life that helped you do something that you normally wouldn't have done? Maybe even you being in graduate school. Yes.
A young girl that wasn't growing up, still depending on mom and dad, and offered her the possibility that she could grow up in secret. And so she wouldn't have to fail because nobody knows she was doing anything different unless she were to tell them. So she could practice being grown up and nobody would know, and then she gets to take all the credit for herself. Nobody knows it doesn't.
Anybody else? Did somebody turn you around? Helped you do something that you didn't think you could do? How'd they do it? I think we'll bet every single one of you has a story of somebody in your life, some teacher, somewhere along the line. You didn't think you could do it. How did you move from a perceived inadequacy? Yes?
I just thought of something that when I was in junior high, the sixth, well, I was in sixth grade, sixth grade, eighth grade, right before high school, I made D's and F's and everything. I was real comfortable with that. And except I couldn't seem to make a D or an F in math. And it seemed to just excel in math and athletics. And everything else was D's and F's. And my science teacher came to me one day and she said, "Now look at your report card." And I said, "Oh, sure." I showed her my report card because I was proud of that whole failure thing. And she said, "That's what I thought." She would see, you know, you made A, you can't make it, and you can't do math thing. And the next time, it was the last time I made a D and F in her class, I made an A in math, A in science, you know, and it was just by someone pointing out that, you know, something that she believed in me.
Great. Great. Thank you. Yes?
There was this fellow, a janitor, as a matter of fact, in the place I worked at. He came in one day, and he was livid because his stepson had trashed out his clothes. He had a gun in his hand, and he was putting bullets in the gun. He told me he was going to go home and kill this kid because he just had it up to here. So we talked a little bit, and then I said, "Well, this kid must be pretty special to you." He says, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you're willing to give up your life to go kill him. So he must be pretty special if you're willing to give up your life." I don't know, just clicked. He put the gun away. I guess I did not hear that he killed his stepson. So.
Yes, Bob?
I remember a man with Rudolph Reich, studying in the hills for a while, while he was work. And I went up to him one time and I said, "Dr. D, I need to go to Chicago." He said, "What for?" I said, "Well, I need to take some real course." He said, "What?" I said, "So I can teach. If we got some students here that would like to learn." He looked me square in the eye and said, "Willhite, teach." Just like that. What are you talking about?
I'm the great Hans.
Yes. And I did. Because he gave me enough confidence that we could do something about it. Here we are.
some of you, I don't know if in my bio it's in the book, I was drafted by Vince Lombardi at Green Bay. Really incredible for I was this little kid from Presbyterian College. Told I was too small to play. Big college, made All-American my senior year, and here the Green Bay Packers drafted me from Clinton, South Carolina. They didn't even know where Presbyterian College was. But I went to Green Bay, and in the off-season I went back to graduate school. The second year I went to the Miami Dolphins, and I got traded there. And Don Shula was the coach. The first year, those of you that follow football, he had been with the Baltimore Colts, and I was fortunate to be at the first game where we were playing in the Orange Bowl. We were playing the 49ers, and Don Shula came and did a similar kind of thing. He said, "Now look, you guys have been losers." And he said, I'm from Baltimore, we're winners. And he basically did one of those Wizard of Oz. I certify you're now winners. Go out there. And we went out and did the 49ers. Similar kind of story. Okay, let me give you folks from Capella this lifestyle interview, because I want to talk about lifestyle as an interview form. You folks have probably had a belly full of lifestyle by now, but I want them to see what you've had. And I want to just talk a minute about how this current version came to be and what I want to say about that. And just a couple of things, and then we'll get more into reframing. When I saw Harold Mozak do that lifestyle, he also did a great metaphor. Some of you have you studied metaphor therapy at all in your curriculum? One of the things I would say for you, Rich Kopp wrote the book Metaphor Therapy. It was an alternative selection of the Behavioral Science Book Club. Rich is an Adlerian from way back. One of the best ways for you to use reorientation is listen for client metaphors. And when a client uses a metaphor, take it literally. He's a pain in my heart, especially when people give me a word and they somatize it. I did a postdoctoral internship in psychoneuroimmunology. P&I. P&I is simply what the holistic health people knew a whole long time ago. It was called mind, body, and spirit. But when the physicians got hold of it, they couldn't possibly say it had anything to do with holistic health. So they gave a very nice, long word that nobody, it's very medical, psychoneuroimmunology. The psychological factors which lead to the neurological breakdown of the immune system. Simple. How do my emotions impact my physical? In clinical psychology, we talk about somatization as one of the DSM-4 diagnoses. To somatize is from the Greek word body. To somatize is to take into my body. And so I want to just talk about that for a minute relative to metaphors, because very often when we use phrases like that in a metaphoric manner, pick up on them and start looking at that literally. What's that pain in your heart like? So I have a process that's in your chapter. I'm not going to go through that for you now, but Rich has a whole model for you how to get a lot of use out of client metaphors. That's one form of reorientation. When clients use somatization, I pay attention to it. P&I, two of the most practical things that P&I has come up with is to find the link between cancer and unresolved anger. Now, a classic idea here is that correlation does not mean causation. Remember, we'll remind you statistically. Somebody with cancer and we find unresolved anger being correlated doesn't mean that my anger caused my cancer. And it certainly doesn't mean that everybody with cancer has anger. We're simply saying those emotions and that somatization often go together. HIV positive has often been correlated with self-deprecation. Now there's a wonderful book if you're interested in this kind of stuff, because the other thing I want to talk a little bit about for a moment is the Western arrogance. So we tend to think that Western psychology is a 20th century phenomenon, and of course we developed it right here in the West, and that's where it came from. Well, there's an Eastern philosophy, Chinese acupuncture, centuries ago. There's a Western psychiatrist who went and studied Eastern acupuncture. And his name is Leon Hamner, and he wrote a neat book called Red Bird Flies, Dragon Rises. It's an integration of Western psychology and Eastern philosophy. And he too points out of how in that tradition, all illness has a spiritual base, by the way. And that every illness in the body has a corresponding emotional imbalance. That's what acupuncture is meant to do. But he also points out how the relationship of the body and the mind. And that's part of what we're going to be looking at tonight. And his idea is, he gives points, for instance, like joy affects the heart. And how many of you saw the movie a couple years ago, Waking Ned Divine? Okay? What happened? Here's a guy, he wins the lottery. He has a heart attack and is holding the winning lottery in his hand. Joy affects the heart. Grief affects the lungs. So there's a whole series of these. I can't remember them all. But the point I want you to make is relative to metaphors. Metaphors, especially when a person uses a metaphor with a somatic term. Pay attention to those. They're a royal way. And oftentimes in therapy, a person comes in and within 2 minutes they've used a metaphor and I've gone away from their content into, what's that pain like? Tell me what that pain's like. What's it look like? What's it feel like? I often have the person close their eyes. What am I doing? Again, I'm changing the state. People come to therapy and they think I'm going to sit and talk. So the other ways to make change, have them move. Have them close their eyes. See, the problem is people just get locked into the therapy is we sit, we talk. So sometimes movement, dance movement therapy. In my class, I have a professional dancer who's in our group. And that's what she does. She teaches dance therapy. Movement is another way. All these are ways to change the frozenness. That's our point in reorientation is frozen. All right. Metaphor therapy. What else did I want to say about that? I think that's, and P&I, psychoneuroimmunology. And I listen for metaphors. And I pay attention to metaphors. When a client uses a metaphor, I change from content to process. And I ask them to be in that process. And in your book, there's a structured way that Rich suggests working with metaphors. So part of our night tonight, again, is how do we make reorientation? And in language, people oftentimes give you the very clues to how that change can take place. Now, let me then move to this whole idea of reframing for a moment. So, okay, let me just orient these people here. And let me tell you how I do a lifestyle. And it's the 3 phases to that lifestyle. Right? The first phase is where you assess where they are right now. And again, I told you my bias is I want the first words out of a person's mouth to be, instead of all the clinical symptoms, you'll notice on my form, I said, tell me what brings you joy. Where do you find happiness? And the other thing, I have stacked the deck with bookends, is that I ask the client to conclude the interview with a peak experience. So in a sense, I want the beginning and the ending, and those of you with this form, I don't think that's on there, but I added it. I want the beginning and the ending to be something uplifting. And I also want it to be so that they don't think they're going to the dentist and having their teeth pulled. Okay, so the first part is their assessment of the way they are in those life tasks. And let me just add that what I did was I added solution-focused therapy, and I also added a lot of Tom Sweeney and the Wheel of Wellness. Tom Sweeney is an Illyrian mentor of mine. He's done a lot at Ohio University. He recently retired as a professor emeritus. He and his wife and a colleague have pointed out that, for instance, less than 1% of our money is spent in prevention. We are a remediation. We are a sickness-oriented culture. A person that comes to you for therapy, if you're going to use third-party input, if they're well, forget it. And even couples therapy, as you know, though, you got to play this game called one person in here is going to get the diagnosis. That's the mental health game. But it's a sickness-based, it is a remediation-based culture. So, I wanted the first and last thing. So part one is where they look at themselves now with the life test, the subjective, all that stuff. And then we segue and say, in order for me to get a greater sense of some of the things that are impacting you now, we shift our framework into that's where we then do all that family of origin. And we're looking for how did I find my place in that first social group. And the conclusions early in life about that life, self, and others. And that's a very important part to reorientation. I'm going to come back and address that. See, because one of the problems is that Adler basically said that by age 7, 5 to 7, we've already started making these decisions about the way things are. But those of you that have studied human development know that Piaget said, you know, we don't even have abstract thought process till we're adolescents. And we're still into concrete conservation up to age 7. We still got kids that think that the long, thin beaker has more in it because it's taller than the little short, fat one. There's no conservation of liquid. So I want you to imagine if you formed a sense of yourself before you even had abstract thought process, then what happens is, Piaget says, there are two forms of learning that take place for us. And the first one is assimilation. And assimilation is what occurs when I run through whatever is happening out there. I run it through what Schulman called a preformed hypothesis. And so we've got a script, and something new happens, and we run it right through our existing program. But if we aren't periodically updating that and finding out viruses and cleaning up the hard drive, and that's the process that Piaget called accommodation. And so as adults, we assimilate and accommodate. And accommodate is the process of creating new schemas. And Piaget called schemas as these, what I'm going to call computer programs. But see, the problem is we form them early in our life. And oftentimes we form them so early, we don't even know we did it before we could even be aware that we did it. So part of the process of therapy and part of the process of a lifestyle is to systematically help you go back and see what are some of those conclusions. And so in addition to the family atmosphere, because that helps me look at family values and all those things, then the third part of the lifestyle is those early memories. And this is the seminal work that Bob has done, and that many of you have studied with Bob, and that's the Willhite process, where he simply takes one early memory. Not simply, profoundly, I would say. He profoundly takes one early memory, has that person write that out line by line, and what were the feelings and what were the emotions, and how would you like to have changed it, and how does that relate to a present situation, right? That's a growth oversimplification, but that's humbling to hear one's life work reduced to such. Not true, but yes, okay. Occam's razor in philosophy is said, take the 50-cent words and make them 5 cents. So that's the Cliff Notes versions of the Willhite process. Willhite. This guy right here. Early memories. Let's talk about that. Early memories are one of the most valuable projective techniques that you have for you, because early memories give you that royal way of seeing early in life, here's the way I looked out on the world, and here's the and therefore. Here's the way it is, and therefore that means such and such. And that last part is the part where reorientation comes into play. And this is the beauty of the Adlerian model, the existential model, that it's based upon this idea that says, I can't change the literalness of what happened. What I do have at my ability to change in any given moment, to use the existential model, is the and therefore. Let me just interject existential philosophy here. I was fortunate in the early 1980s. I was teaching at U.S. International University in San Diego, and Viktor Frankl was on the faculty. Amazing for me. Viktor Frankl, for those of you that don't know, wrote the classic book, Man's Search for Meaning. Around 2000, they were having the top everything, right? The top 100 this. Man's Search for Meaning was voted in around 2000 as one of the top 10 most influential books in 20th century Western literature. Not psychology, Western literature. And Viktor Frankl was a Jewish German psychiatrist, most of you know that story, taken prisoner by the Nazis, in prison, and he squirreled away little scraps of paper. And he said, somebody needs to write about, number one, the hellishness of the human experience, and yet number two, how do people somehow rise above that? And he liked to quote Nietzsche. So what I'm doing right now is I'm giving you an overlay to link with you with existential with Adler. Because the existentialists say the and therefore. That's the piece that I want you to think about. So Frankl quoted Nietzsche, who said, "A man that has a why, W-H-Y, or his life," he was still in the masculine tense, so I'm going to quote him directly. "A man that has a why for his life can withstand almost any how." Now that is the essence of existential, which basically says, if I have meaning, or to use the existential, if I have an existential anchor, that can help me survive. And so I want to just say a little bit about existential philosophy because it is absolutely aligned with Adlerian philosophy theory in my opinion. Because existential philosophy says that existence precedes essence. Now let me define what that means. Basically the existentialists say you plant an acorn and with proper, you'll get an oak tree. Or you plant a tomato plant and with proper nurture, you get a tomato tree. But you plant a human being seed, we don't know. Why? Because human beings define themselves through their choices. And one of the things that Frankl was one of his koans was he said, the last fundamental human freedom is the choice of the attitude I take toward any experience. Now that's an important concept for you when it comes to reorientation. We cannot rewrite history. And so when people go, why are you looking at all that? It just happened that way. Because it's the and therefore that is under our power to change. That's the optimistic part of existentialism. Listen to this positive place of rage and anger. The poet Maya Angelou. It's called "And Still I Rise." You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? Because I walk like I got oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons and like suns with the certainty of tides. Just like hope springing high. Still, I'll rise. Do you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes? Shoulders falling down like teardrops weakened by my soulful cries? Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, 'cause I laugh like I got gold mines digging in my own backyard. You may shoot me with your words. You may cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness. But still, like air, I'll rise. Out of the huts of history's shame I rise. Up from a past rooted in pain I rise. Leaving behind the night of terror and fear I rise. Into a daybreak that's wonderfully clear. I rise, bringing the gifts my ancestor gave. I am the dream. I am the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. You feel that? Wow. This is someone that said, I don't know what I can do about enslavement, but my bitterness and in my pain, I'll rise. In our culture, by age 18, 70% of the women are physically, emotionally, or sexually abused. That equals women. And what's the end therefore? And what's the conclusion? You become bitter, you become angry, you become rageful. And by the way, it's not exclusively a women's trait. Men can abuse in their own ways. Or do you perhaps reframe that and go, I want to make sure other women don't necessarily feel this. At the Adverian Conference in Chicago, the Social Interest Award for the outstanding organization demonstrating social interest was given to a shelter abuse for women. And when the woman spoke, she made a profound statement. Some of you may have known this, but I had never heard it. We have 3 times as many animal shelters as we do shelters for women that are abused. So what did you do with that abuse? And by the way, I studied with Jean Houston. I was fortunate to go to Egypt and Greece as part of a multicultural experience. And she has a neat book called The Search for the Beloved. Search for the Beloved. And then she has a chapter on wounding. And she basically says, every one of us has been wounded in some way, shape, or form. What do we do with that wounding? What is the end therefore? Most of us in here have hopefully in that wounding said, I want to work with people. I want to make the world a better place. I want there to be a little less wounding. Almost all physicians' early recollections and all people that are in the medical profession, Adler, one of his early memories was fear of dying. Which, by the way, just since we're into early memories, it's an interesting experience of how our own later experience can distort reality. But one of Adler's early memories, and when he went back to his boyhood home, he remembered the fear, the absolute terror that he had, because when he was a kid, he had to go from his backyard through a graveyard to get to his classroom. And so as he comes to his old boyhood home, and many of you may have had that experience. Have you ever had that experience where it's unbelievable because all these memories are like connected to that experience? They all come flooding. And so he goes up and knocks on the door and says, you know, it wasn't, even his family wasn't there, or somebody else. He said, I know this is strange, but I grew up here as a boy, and really, would you let me come into your backyard, and I'd like to go through the graveyard because I'm a man now, and I was always so afraid. And they looked at him like, what do you mean? What graveyard? There's no graveyard in this backyard. He's like, you're out of your mind. He wasn't around back. There was no graveyard. There had never been a graveyard. Adler, in his own fears, had created, and he would have believed up to that time that that was as real as anything else. But that was simply in his young boyhood fear of dying. And what did he do? What decision and what was his conclusion? Because he likes to contrast a similar experience of a person who had the same fear of dying, and what he did was he buried people, so that every time he buried them, he was saying, well, it's them and not me. That's how they dealt with their fear of dying. So what I want to propose to you is every one of us here has been wounded in some way, shape, or form. And therefore, what? That's where change is possible for us. But we can't change something that we're unaware of. And so lifestyle is one of those techniques to help me get at those early formative events. Not the only one, but it's a very powerful one. Now let's talk about reframing as a particular intervention. And yeah, you can pass these now. So let's see. I'm understanding we go till 11:30. Is that right? We got a contract. Are we goal aligned, or are we slightly unbalanced? What is it? 9:15.
9:15. Yeah.
9:15. All right. Now, as I said, earlier version of this is in your lifestyle notebook, but this is my latest version. And I'm gonna point out a couple of things for you, and I happen to feel pretty good about some of the writing here, and so I'm gonna. Some of you are auditory, and those of you that are auditory have enjoyed what I've been saying. Others of you are visual, and so I'm going to attempt to link auditory and visual here. Visual learners, whenever I say things, often say, why are you saying it? Because I can read it. So let me just, again, have you practice social interest and imagine that there are visual and auditory learners. The kinesthetic people just breathe deeply and feel good warm thoughts. The olfactory ones, if you can just imagine the scent of pine tree or something with those trees. I would like you to walk with me through parts of this because I want to do it in a sequential manner as much as possible. Those of you that are oppositional, defiant, go ahead and go all over the page. You're going to do it anyway. Fight authority, resist it. Those of you that are highly compliant, please consider going with me as I go through.
No problem.
At an early age, people formulate to form conclusions about their world. What a pitiful incident. Okay. Just sorry. You get so close to something and you go, I can't believe I just said that. And I was so proud of what I was going to say to you about my writing. It's unreal. Okay, so at an early age, people formulate to form conclusions about the world. What that means, I have not an idea. But we formulated and we formed conclusions. So here we go. Once we formulated and formed conclusions, these lifestyle decisions have been decided lifestyle as conclusions about life in general, others, etc. Now, such impressions may be either positive, negative, or a combination of both. Now, here's the physiology I want you to think about. These etchings create a literal groove. Your early recollections, physiologically, are a groove on your brain. They are impressions that are formed there. Thus, a person in a new learning environment brings to the party a preformed working experiences. This happened to me, and therefore it means that. Now, I've talked to you about assimilation and accommodation, but I want to go down to the last paragraph there, and I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about paradigms. And basically, this is a classic one in the business world. The Swiss automaker, the Swiss watchmakers in the 1950s had 90% of the market in Swiss watches. And then someone came along and invented quartz crystal movement. And he invented it in a Swiss watch factory. And he brought it to his superior, all pleased with himself, and the superior said, it's got no moving parts, it's not a watch, this is ridiculous. They didn't patent this process. So at the annual watchmakers convention, the Swiss little maker, their person from Texas Instruments went by, and there was this quartz crystal. And that person went, now this is interesting. I never thought of this with a watch, but that's fascinating. Wrote down some notes. Seiko, same thing. 10 years later, 90% of the market had shifted from Swiss to quartz crystal. The majority of you have on a watch that has quartz crystal movement. What happened? The paradigm prevented new learning because the person said, this is not a watch. You've heard that classic outside the box and the 9 dots. That's what happened in that paradigm. That person could not accommodate. The Gulf War, or the oil embargo in the 70s, another example. In the United States, we had no paradigm that said all those little warring OPEC countries that were all in competition with each other, we had no paradigm that said, you know what, maybe one day they'll figure out we got all what they want. If we just keep fighting, quit fighting among ourselves, and we put it together, we got a cartel. OPEC was born. And they just simply turned off the spigot. How could they do this radical thing? These bunch of warring, rivaling tribes, we had no paradigm that considered that they could link together and do that. And so the idea that I want you to consider is that a paradigm, unless it gets changed, can be very limiting. Now, when I taught in Malaysia, I gave this example. Some of you may have heard. This was the ones that they liked. This was their favorite one. I'll give you another example of paradigm. A guy has a white Beamer in Southern California, And he, actually Northern California, there's a beautiful scenic highway along A1A, Big Sur, some of that some of you may know. And there's these roads that run right alongside the ocean. And his promotion to vice president made him then get a perk of a BMW convertible. So here he is, he's out in his power, he's got the window down, he's swimming around. And so as he comes around one of these curves, there's a woman that's in a red Mercedes convertible, her top down, and she whizzes by him, and as they pass, she hollers, "Pig!" Well, he immediately, oh man, damn feminist, you know, and so he's so proud of himself because before she can get by him, he wheels around and hollers, "Cow!" He goes around the corner and he runs into a pig. What was the paradigm? And how did the paradigm funnel information and distort it? That's where we come about in a lifestyle. Is we begin to help people identify what are those paradigms. What is that computer program that I developed early in life? And that unless I accommodate, then I become a washing machine with no rinse cycle. Why do I keep marrying and divorcing the same person? They have a different name. They have a different look. Why? Because we hadn't rinsed it out, folks. We hadn't figured out whatever that was. And so we just keep going through the cycle, and there ain't no rinse cycle. That's what we're trying to do in reorientation, is let's clean up the program. Let's clean up the hard drive. Let's find the viruses. Now, this is the idea of private logic, and I want to, I love it when you find this. This is in your book, but let me just read it for you, because I know you've read it 2 or 3 times. Some of you might be the first time you've ever heard it. It's at page 8. Imagine you're given the task of the size of fish, to find the size of fish in Lake Michigan. So you go and you gather some fish, and you've got a 4-inch mesh, and your friends say, you come back and say, the fish in Lake Michigan are 4 inches in size or larger. Now your friend has a net that has a 2-inch mesh. And so your friend comes back and his report says the fish in Lake Michigan are 2 inches in size or larger. Now who's right? And here's the question. Each of you is reporting on the size of the net you use. The size of the net you use determines the size of the fish you collect. And here's the creative metaphor that I love. We're in the metaphors. We have nets in our heads. These nets are not made of threads, but they're made of past learnings and past experiences, motives, fears, desires. These nets act as a filter, so from our environment, they go through that filter to be perceived. Each one of us has our own little net, our own little personal filter. Even though we may be placed in the same environment, we won't see it in the same way. Most of us are not even aware this filtering process takes place. Many of us have defective filters, filters that are so clogged up that they distort the stimuli that comes to us from the environment. The important thing to remember, though, is whenever we make a comment about something, we are not describing the something, but rather our net, our filter. We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are in this 9 and 7. So, what are we doing in lifestyle? That's paradigms. That's what I want to talk about there. I want you to take a moment, and I want you to just right around you with a couple people here, I want you to contemplate these 5 issues. And I want to preempt that by the classic work with Albert Ellis, who said you're standing in a bus stop, somebody comes along and bumps into the back of you, you wheel around angry to confront your attacker, and you find the person's blind, and he says, what happens to your anger? Did the person who bumped you make you mad? No, it was my interpretation of that. But we also were able to shift that. So I want you to contemplate for a moment these questions. How do you make up your mind? Number 1. Have you ever changed your mind? Number 2. How long did it take? 3. What were the significant factors that led to you changing your mind? Number 4. And how would you as a counselor who wanted to influence somebody else to change his or her mind, how would you do it? So contemplate change of your mind for a moment. With the neighborhood, just a couple of those, react to some of those questions. take a long time to change. Let me, as I mentioned to you, growing up in a biblical family, I want to share to me one of the poignant stories of a reframe that to me was just really wonderful, because when Christ was on the cross, and those of you that are from that tradition, this is my version of the story, and it's pretty close, but it's still creative. There were two thieves that were on either side, and they were also there. And the first thief basically said, you know, hey, we've heard pretty good stuff here, and it seems like you're a pretty powerful kind of guy. Again, this is kind of a loose translation. And he said, how about getting us and you down, because you can do this. My man. Again, kind of loose. The other thief rebuked the first one and said, wait a minute. You know, we're here because we're getting logical consequences. I went to this Ladlerian course, and they basically said the logical consequence of robbing and thieving is getting. So we're here, we're getting our just desserts. But this is an innocent man, and this is the part I love. He turned to Christ, and then he said, remember me when you come in paradise. To which Christ said, tonight, not, you know what, go through a lifestyle analysis, and you go through 3 years of therapy, and you know what, maybe you come back and you'll make some change. But he said, tonight, you'll be with me in paradise. Because in my opinion, what happened is, whatever that person's whole life, whatever his life had been, in that one moment, when he made that one shift, everything changed immediately. Now, I don't want to propose to you that change is that easy, and for many of us, it's taken a long time, and that's its own level of process. But I wanted you to be considering, first of all, the contemplation is that it is possible. And that's a big part of what existential philosophy says, because they basically say, every day, I have the option for me to do something different and to do something new. It's just simply my own conditioned habits and my unexamined life which cause me to become much more robotic. Now, as we go about reframing, I want to remind you that the great contribution, one of great Adler's great contributions, was this idea of social interest. And he basically said that is the barometer of mental health. Contemplate social interest, or the lack thereof, in the following story called The Cold Within. 6 humans trapped by happenstance in dark and bitter cold. Each one possessed a stick of wood, or so the story is told. Their dying fire in need of logs. The first woman held hers back, for on the faces around the fire, she noticed one was black. The next man looking across the way saw not one of his church, and couldn't bring himself to give the fire his stick of birch. The third one sat in tattered clothes. He gave his coat a hitch. Why should his log be put to use? To warm the idle rich. The rich man just sat back and thought of the wealth he had in store, and how to keep what he had earned from the lazy, shiftless poor. The black man's face bespoke revenge as the fire passed from sight. For all he saw in his stick of wood was a chance to spite the white. The last man of this forlorn group did not accept for gain, giving only to those who gave was how he played the game. The logs held tight in death's still hands was proof of human sin. They didn't die from the cold without. They died from the cold within. Social interest. Reverend Ike was a charismatic evangelist minister in the 80s. I haven't heard a lot from him lately, but when I was growing up, he was real big. And basically, he had this unique philosophy that said, give to my church, and you'll be so abundant, and you'll just be wealthy. It'll make you and me happy. Let me tell you a little bit about the wisdom of Reverend Ike. And it's written up, and I've got it here, but I want to give you my version of it. When he was a kid, he grew up in Harlem. And early in his life, Reverend Ike looked around his world and said, you know what? This just doesn't work for me. I need to have something, I need to have, this ain't the story. I walked in on somebody else's movie. He got 10 cents allowance a week. He would take that 10 cents and he would put it in a bus stop, and he would drive to the Upper West Side, to Manhattan. And he would get out of the bus, and he would go to where the uppity white folks were, and he would stand outside the most fancy restaurants, and he simply looked inside and he watched them eat food. And he imagined as a little kid, what do they experience when they're eating that food? What do you think that tastes like? What's it feel like? And he started creating new impressions. And he started creating new etchings on his mind. And he also said something about, you know, when I grow up, I'm going to be in there just like them. This is interesting. This is a kid who early on said, you know what, this picture ain't going to work for me. And I'm not just going to passively accept that this is the way it is. And I call that the difference between an 8-ball and a cue ball. Because an 8-ball sits on the table and gets knocked in the side corner and the game is over. An 8-ball is acted upon. And so self-determination is one of the other variables that EQ, emotional quotient, Daniel Goleman, all of those have said the ability to be a motivator, to be an 8-ball as opposed to a cue ball makes things happen. So how do we help people find it? Well, we create new images. That's one. So to reframe is to take something from its original context and put it into a different meaning. And the examples that are given here, I could say, look on page 3 of your little paper. A person that's compulsive, the positive part of that would be organized. A person that's sloppy, I could say, well, they're casual or relaxed. A person that's very loud, I would tend to rather think of myself as being more enthusiastic. Now, reframing. The movie Moonstruck, the example I give in this paper. It's not in your book, so these are all new stuff. There's that great reframe. Those of you who remember Moonstruck and Cher and Nicholas Cage? And Nicholas Cage is the baker, right? Who got his hand burned. And Cher does this wonderful example, and she pointedly uses the metaphor of a lone wolf. And he gnaws off his own leg to avoid the trap of marriage. And she basically said, "You're that guy. You gnawed off the hand in order to avoid that." That's a great reframe. Look at page 4. Because in this paper I went a step further and I talked specifically, how do we reframe? Step 1, using the non-judgmental cycle, fully understand the problem. The non-judgmental judgment gives the helper a grasp of the details of the problem, including the individuals involved, the relationships, and the environment where the problem exists. Before reframing, it's especially helpful to reflect the meaning to get at the client's world view, not work view. Oh, pardon me, this is painful. Okay, the courage to be imperfect has its limitations. It's not the time to be doing it. So number 2 in a reframe, build a bridge from the person's viewpoint to a new way of looking at the problem. Develop a reframe that bridges the person's old view of the problem with a new viewpoint that stresses the positive aspects of the problem or presents it as solvable. The important point is to acknowledge some aspects of the client's viewpoint while at the same time suggesting another way of looking at it. And number 3 is called reinforcing the bridge. A shift in perspective is often something that develops slowly. One way of sustaining the perspective shift is to assign homework that forces the client to see the problem in a new light. Practical way to go about reframing. Turn over to page 7. This is in your workbook, and you may have looked at it, but I think it's worthwhile looking at cognitive reframing. And it's simply a process where you write down on the left-hand side all the particular reactions that the person had, the subjective experiences, and then on the right-hand side, the first thing, and this is a cognitive behavioral therapy technique, but it's very useful. Talk what's called, what would a camera have observed or recorded? So the very first reframe in this case was that my boss has given me a bad evaluation, and I'll never get promoted. To which the therapist says, well, what would a camera have recorded? Well, the camera reported me getting my performance evaluation, and I got one unsatisfactory mark. That's a whole different story, right? So take a moment, I'll let you look down that cognitive reframe. Again, some of you may have already seen it, but let's just take a moment and see. That's a cognitive perceptual, it's called rebuttal. So you're overgeneralizing. It's all part of what Ellis does, and it's all part of why Ellis is a member of the Adlerian Society and credits a lot of his work to Adler, because Adler was one of the original cognitive restructuring. Now I want to talk about that concept that's just below that chart called negative attribution. Because one of the other things that is absolutely damaging to any relationship is the word attribution means to attribute. Your husband brings you flowers. That must mean he's having an affair. And what happens is that people come into therapy, and oftentimes what they've done is they've made their conclusion become the ultimate truth. He's having an affair. Well, how do you know that? Because he brought me flowers. Oh, okay. Help me understand how that becomes a negative attribution. And so one reframe, a wonderful concept from the Adlerian idea, is called ascribing noble intention. It's the antipathy of negative attribution. And it basically says, until I'm proven wrong, I'm at least going to give you, quote, the benefit of the doubt. So ascribing noble intention would be, well, I'm willing to consider, until I find out different, you brought me flowers because maybe you really love me. Can you begin to get an appreciation, and especially in relationships? This is very damaging. Is this idea of attribution, because when we attribute, we go beyond the behavior, and we then say, and here's what that means. And when we do that in a negative way, the person is damned because it's in our own mind. It ain't even existed in them. Now, I'm a single guy, and one of the things that's happened in my life is I go through attraction, approach, rejection. I've gone through that whole scenario before a woman's ever even interacted with me. It's all in my own mind. I just go through it. She wrinkles her little nose, and that old man, that back to Billy Bob, getting Mary Sue's favorite Valentine when we were in the 5th grade, and it's just that a pattern. It's just gone forward in my life. So what happens? I just am quick to draw pretty much a negative conclusion. And she was just maybe getting something out of her eye, or who knows what. One of life's great ironies is I teach marriage courses. I've been divorced twice. I know nothing about the subject other than I write books about it. So that's good. Sublimation. Look at page 8. Here's some examples of reframing from a word to another: helplessness, coping, depression, persistence, distrust, loyalty. But I also want to read the section under literal reframing. A literal reframe is you literally change the frame around the story.
This goes right to the heart of upright logic, right?
Yeah. Right. I'm basically confronting what that is. Yeah. Now, by the way, in the early days of the Adlerian theory, private logic really meant almost like pathology, because it was in contrast to, quote, public logic. But much more, we're just saying it in terms of phenomenology, because all of us have one. And those of you that are going to go get licensed and go through that, and those of you that are in the clinical site, I'm going to guarantee you're going to get a question on George Kelly. What's George Kelly most known for? Personal constructs. Very consistent with private logic. Basically, Kelly said each of us has our own construct 4 concepts: love. And so when a person comes to me and says, I'm depressed, I know what that means to me. I can even give you a DSM-4 definition of depression, but I don't know what that is to them. So the first step is, tell me about your depression. Tell me about your personal construct. You're going to get a question on George Kelly, personal constructs. You heard it here. Give me thanks.
Thank you.
George Kelly is noted for the concept of personal constructs. Each of us. When I studied with Gene Houston in Egypt, we went to the hieroglyphs in the pyramids. The Egyptian language, by the way, the word had the literalness. Okay, so the word for this table would have a symbol of a tree and would have wood. But the problem is our language is abstract. All I did was, when I was early on, somebody said, this means table. There's no literal link. And that's where personal constructs come. Now, most of us have a shared idea of table. But the point is, every one of us has our own unique experiences about table. Or maybe even this word knocking. Which reminds me of another story. Hope you like the stories. That's really what it's all about. It's probably what you remember. There was a concert pianist 3 years ago that wrote a book called Memory Slips. And this is what reminded me of it. And this is how our past, oftentimes that we've buried, has a little jack-in-the-box way of popping out at the most unpleasant, unexpected time. She's a famous concert pianist. She is in front of her piano, and she is ready to do her concert. And there was a patron, a male patron, who arrived late, and as fate would have it, he was like in the 3rd row in the very center. And so, as he's walking across, and she's just getting ready to do her concert, the sound of him walking triggered her back to her childhood. And she began to hear the sound of her father night after night coming to her door to sexually abuse her. And she remembered the exchange that they had made, because the father had given her the gift of piano lessons in exchange for her silence of what was happening night after night. And so as this man walks and she hears that sound, she is flooded. She is flooded with those memories that she had even forgotten about. She couldn't have told you before that even occurred. It was uncontrollable. She was back in herself as a child. She put her head down on the piano and wept uncontrollably. Could not complete the concert, and in fact had a complete breakdown. And the story, Memory Slips, is a courageous story of her 3-year journey in therapy to go through that process. And what was neat was, in the back of it was a little CD or a little cassette or something, which was basically when she came back and she made her re-debut, she played the very piece that she had not been able to complete. Quite a dramatic form of therapy. And that was her healing. And so one of the things when we come to reframing, or one of the things that comes to reorientation, is we've got to work on introjects and things that we thought we had buried that we don't even know that are still there. So that's what happens in repression. We tend to bury it, but it comes out in other ways. So the other thing we're looking for in reframing is called interjection. Now this is in your book on page 10, but just listen to it, okay? Just hear this, because you may have already read it. But Tom Robbins did this great story called Even Cowgirls Get the Blues. It's a wonderful story about a woman named Sissy Hankshaw, and she has these huge thumbs. Well, her parents early in life decide she's deformed, and they have one of them surgically cut back. But she goes like, wait a minute, she's a great reframer. She says, wait just a minute, man, this is neat. And she becomes the best hitchhiker that ever was. She flips out this humongous thumb, and people stop for miles around. Anyway, they made it into a movie. It was an atrocity of the movie. They didn't even have this line in the movie, and it was sad, but it was a great story. But here's the line about the interjects. And as a writer, I love when people can use words like this. So just maybe close your eyes or look down and just let the words pour over you. From the wall of the middle room, fresh, pure water drips constantly. It is as if the walls are weeping. It is as if the soul of the continent is weeping. Why does it weep? It weeps for the decline of poets. It weeps for the bone of the buffalo. It weeps for the black people who think like white people. It weeps for the Indians who think like settlers. It weeps for children who think like adults. It weeps for magic that has been forgotten. It weeps for the free who think like prisoners. But most of all, it weeps for cowgirls who think like cowboys. So interjects. Things happened. We were told about the way boys were, girls were, and oftentimes we're not even aware that we bought into that. A couple of years ago, I was teaching a class and I used the word jig. And then I was like, I grew up in the South. And I was like, wait a minute, where did that come from? Is that jig as in jig-a-boo? That was one of the things I grew up talking about blacks. That's separate. I mean, I grew up in that era. Separate bathrooms, separate water fountains, unbelievable in my lifetime. I started asking myself, well, fortunately, I gave myself the benefit of the doubt that actually jig was an Irish dance. But I can remember like using the term and I was like even surprised. Where did that come from? Ever had that? Where you just like, you say something and it's like something that happened early, that's an interject. And so one of the processes of what a lifestyle does, or in that process, we're trying to look at what are things that I just bought into and I didn't even know I bought into them. It just happened so early in my life. I just bought into that's the way things are. That's the way men are, women are, I am, others are. I want to consider another reframing story. Remember I talked about all of us are wounded? 9 o'clock, hang on, 9:15, I'm oriented. I'm a person who likes this. It's always important for you to know that. Minutes after 9. Oh. All right. This is in your book. It's also on page 13. I'm just going to read. A water bearer brought these pots. And I'll give you the short story of it. And the one pot is all embarrassed because it's got a crack in the side. And he feels really bad because the master, they're taking it up to the king's house, and he's basically saying, I feel really bad because the pot on the other side is perfect. It delivers a full pot. And mine, I'm cracked. And I feel really bad. I'm not doing my job. And the person that's the water bearer says, wait a minute. Now, wait a minute. You're doing just fine. And again, they go up there and he spills out half his load. And then he basically says, now let's look tomorrow. And I want you to notice all these beautiful flowers that are along the way. And you see, I knew you were cracked. And so what's happened is, along the way, as you spilled water, I planted all these seeds. And all these beautiful flowers have grown over on your side. Notice there's none on the other side. And so this crack in your side has helped you water these seeds. And these seeds have developed plants, and they make my master happy. And the last line that I want you to think about is, each of us has our own unique flaws. We're all cracked pots. In God's great economy, nothing goes to waste. Don't be afraid of your flaws. Acknowledge them, and you too can be the cause of beauty. Know that paradoxically in our weakness, we indeed find our strength. The great gift to us, potentially, of wounding is we can learn compassion. We can learn empathy. We can learn the feeling of what it's like for the people that come in our office. I won't know their pain, but I certainly know I've had my share of this. The other thing I want you to think about in terms of reframing, I did humor. Humor is another form of reframe. Sam Keen in The Power of Stories says, have your clients retell their story. So the people that come in and tell their story as a tragedy, have them tell it as a comedy. Or have them tell it as a great adventure. See, that's the literal reframing. Tell the story differently. And again, when I say people come in and they tell you their stories, well, what would it be if you had made this into a comedy? Take the tragedy out of it and let's just see, tell me the story as if it were a mystery or a suspense novel. That's a reframing of the story. So what I did here was, in my own creative way, I basically said, I have been a member of the most dysfunctional groups that ever exist in the universe. It's called faculty committee meetings. 30 years I have served on faculty committee meetings. And I've learned a thing or two about group dynamics, and I describe them here. Here's the way we often operate. Delay, deny, dominate, discourage, defer, deflect, or drop. Right? That's a short course in group dynamics right there. Delay. That's a great idea. We'll get to it next week. Deny. It's not my job. Dominate. Intimidation. Interrogation. Discourage. Who wrote that report? Defer. That's a really great job for else. Deflect. It's more appropriate for so-and-so. Drop it. We ain't got time, money, resources, so turn out the large parties over. I reframe that to the 7 C's. Caring, compromise, compliment, collaborate, kiss, concise, contact. It's humor, hopefully. I got 3 case studies that I just added that are not in your book. Oh, we got one just last week in our group that Russ was with. This guy just spontaneously said, behind every wine is a wish. Isn't that incredible? Behind every wine is a wish. Fritz Perls did a great reframe. Okay, the master had this person study with him, and basically they were going through a painful divorce, and I remember saying this one time, somebody said, is there any other kind? So anyway, this guy's standing up in front of the group, and Fritz Perls would be over in the corner, and this guy would start saying, I'm really being warm and genuine, I'm being authentic because I'm going through this divorce and it's really having a hard time for me. And over in the corner, Fritz would go, wah! And the guy is like, I'm in front of the group and you're humiliating me, and then Fritz would go, wah! Well, he did this through 3 straight workshops. And you know, only his respect for his authority figure kept him. But finally, even that deteriorated. And the 3rd workshop, when Fritz hears that sound, he went over and he grabbed him by the throat and was choking him. And people had to pull him off of Fritz Perls. Fritz Perls gets up, wipes himself off, and gets up and says, I think you're going to be okay now. Powerful. What? What was he doing? He was changing the state, right? He just took the sound of whining and basically spit in the soup big time. Now, I have 3 case studies for you, and they're written on page 9. And I'm going to give you a moment just to scan those, and then I'm going to conclude with a story that's my signature piece in this whole piece. But these are case studies from my own clinical and coaching. I'm going to conclude, understanding some of you use speed reading, but I want to share with you my own personal example. I'm going to give you the short story of it. It's written up in detail there. I'm very pleased and honored that this story was selected for Chicken Soup for the Teacher's Soul. That's currently the #1 bestseller in the New York Times. And it's a real honor for me because they told me they had 5,000 submissions. And so mine was one of 50 from that group. So it's an honor. And it's a story that I wrote about 7 years ago, Thanksgiving evening, and I felt like many of us on Thanksgiving Day, who am I thankful for? And so, without going into the prose there. I'll just say that I was in the 7th grade, and I was in 7B. All my friends were in 7A. When we were growing up, in earlier years, there had been the Redbirds and the Bluebirds. And all my friends had been in the Bluebird class, and I was in the Redbird class. And I'm so dyslexic, I really can't even remember if I was a Redbird or a Bluebird, but I knew this. They were the smart ones, and we were the dummy group. And so in the 7th grade, they finally figured out we knew what was what, so they just called us A and B. Now, all my friends are in the A class. I'm in the B class. They're all smart. I'm majoring in playground. I'm an honor student. Yes, Your Honor. No, Your Honor. I won't do that anymore, Your Honor. So one day, Mr. King, the 7th grade teacher who had both 7A and B, basically came to my friends and said, you know, there's somebody in the other class, and he's just as smart as any of the rest of you, but he just doesn't know it yet. And I won't tell you who he is, but he's the kid that outruns all of you, and he's the kid that knocks the ball over the right field fence. I'm left-handed. I'm dyslexic. It's pretty clear who he's talking about. Well, my friends that afternoon, when we get on the bus, go, you know, here's what Mr. King said about you. And I go, oh, yeah, you got to be kidding, sure. Being real nonchalant, because that's what cool 7th grade boys do. But on another deeper level, that had ignited some kind of candle within my soul. Well, then a couple of weeks later, it was time for oral book reports. Well, it's one thing to write reports that only Mr. King looks, but alas, there's nowhere to hide when it comes time for oral book reports. So I stand up and I start talking about James Fenimore Cooper's The Pathfinder. And I get so excited because as I'm talking, I got images of the Indians going down the canoes, and I got them walking through the forest, going noiselessly. And so I'd be right in the middle of one sentence, and I would just not finish that sentence, and I'd go to another one. And my friends all started laughing because I didn't make any sense, even though there were explosions happening inside my head. And so I went to sit down all discouraged and defeated, and here was the part that was really neat for me. Here's the refrain. The laughter ceased at the sound of Mr. King's deep, compassionate voice, page 12. You know, Danny, he rained forth, you got the unique gift of being able to speak outwardly and to think inwardly at the same time. But the problem is sometimes your mind is filled with so much joy, your words can't keep up with it. Your excitement is contagious. It's a wonderful gift that I hope you'll put to good use someday. And then I conclude and say, 40 years later, I take this time to say thank you for all the nameless Mr. and Miss Kings. I got fancy words now of changing a perceived minus into a perceived plus. But 40 years ago, a person saw something inside me and helped make a big difference in my own life. That was the refrain. Now, I want to take a moment, and I've asked Susan and Bob, even though the hour's late, I know, but I'm going to ask them to give you their version of the reorientation and lifestyle, and I'm going to turn the podium over to you folks.
Thank you, Dan. Before you get away, though, as I recall, the North American Society of Behavioral Psychology presented you with an honor in Chicago.
Yes.
What was that?
I was given a plaque for 30 years of contributions to the Iberian group in general and the Corps of Representatives.
This guy knows what he's talking about. I hope you found this helpful. I mentioned to Dan that one of the techniques I use in looking at recollections, when I get stuck, like I'm crazy, right? Fantasizing. In million terms, you cannot fantasize something that's not consistent with your private logic anyway. So they come up with a different story, reframe, and then we have that to build on to work for getting unstuck, so to speak. So I use fantasy in treatment also. Now, 20 years ago, they thought I was nuts. You can't do that. You're getting into craziness, but it works.
Well, one thing that I think is important is that sense of self-worth that's tied to what's going on in terms of their behavior. And even though it's not positive and not working very well, at least they feel a little sense of worth from this. But to change, if you were to tell them to change, they're thinking, but then I have to give up what little self-worth I have. And you're saying, if I do this, I'm going to feel good. Well, hey, who are you? So one of the things that sometimes is helpful is to give them an opportunity to change that's relatively safe and won't cause them too much anxiety and fear. And so an example might be to offer them the opportunity to change just a little bit in a place where it's going to be of the least amount of trauma to them and where they see the least possibility for damage. So for example, I might say to them, and they've always kept their mouths shut because their belief is if I open my mouth, somebody's going to tell me I'm wrong, and then I'm going to be worthless. And so I might suggest that they decide at one time and at one place where they might open their mouth and speak up about something. But I even offer them the possibility that they could take out a little insurance, we call it. And I say, you know, what you could do is, if you're concerned that they're really going to destroy your worth over the fact you open your mouth, we could have this little insurance policy that says, that if you do this at work, for example, that you can come to work the next day and tell them what a terrific headache you had yesterday, and you know you just weren't yourself. So they have that escape hatch, so that it gives them the opportunity to try out something different and know that they could still salvage their sense of self-worth, which they at the current time believe is attached. Now hopefully eventually you're going to work with them to the point where that they detach it, but in the meantime it gives them the courage to take a little whack, because they can, one, do it, and I'll often say, go out and do it with the grocery clerk. Speak up to the grocery clerk that doesn't even know you. Do a little bit, a little small piece, and you always can go back to the old way. This offers them, I think oftentimes when we are encouraging change, we're encouraging a huge, big change, and that's way beyond them. It's like you got to get your toe wet before you learn how to swim. So offering them an opportunity to change just a little bit and having a way to back out if it doesn't work gives them the courage to try something different, and then they can come back and tell you what happened, and of course usually they say, well, gee whiz, you know, I did it and nothing happened, or people liked me this way. And so it can be really positive. I had a woman who was very shy, and I suggested that, did she ever go to a meeting where she didn't know anybody? Yeah, she did. I said, well, what if you just went up to one person, total stranger, you'll never see her again, one person in the whole crowd, just go up and say, you know, I just thought I'd come say hi to you. I'm really pretty shy at these places, and I just thought I'd come and say hello. And so she did, and she came back and said, wow, that person said she's really shy too, and she was so impressed with me that I had the courage to come up and talk to her, and she was so enthusiastic that she decided she could do more of that, so she could build up.
I want to just say what a joy it's been for 20 years to have known the two of you. Susan and I worked together on the Corps representative and a former president of the North American Society of Athletic Psychology. You just walked in and tried to unobtrusively walk out. Choir that many of you know here. And what I want to, my last thing, and then if you want to give them any charges here. In the back of this book, there is a NASAP membership application. And I put that in there seriously. I urge you to consider being an actual member of the Adlerian group. I know you're in a school of Adler. I believe that our motto, helping change the world, isn't something we take lightly. It's been wonderful for me to have had 3 decades. I've got 20 years of experience with the two of my dear friends here. I am a member of that Corps of Representatives. I'm a representative of business and organization. You're an affiliate of the group. Please consider joining. As a student member, as a member, you certainly are a member of the Minneapolis group. I think next year the conference in Vancouver, I think, first of all, there's there's a lot of good people, and there are people that are just doing seminal work and making a difference in the world. So please consider being a part of that in addition to Minneapolis. Bob?
Thank you, Dan, for
Thank
being here, and thank your friend for coming with you. I'm amazed of how attentive this was here. Usually they're unreal. Any questions before we go home?
I got one I want to ask for you first. And I think in terms of reframing, there's a woman who did a program, she was in a wheelchair with cerebral palsy, and she basically did this wonderful comment about talking about the difference between a disability and an other ability. And she talked about how she had a disability in one area and an ability in another. And what's been so courageous for me personally has been how you've confronted and dealt with very great physical challenges. And I just thought maybe you might share what you've done.
Very
personally.
briefly, I do have cerebral palsy from birth, and being born with it, I think, what's the problem? If you got a problem with it, that's, I'm doing fine. And as I kept going on and on, people kept saying, you got a problem. And I said, yeah, okay. And I wasn't supposed to get up and speak. I'm not supposed to give talks. I'm not supposed to lecture. I'm not supposed to teach. And somebody told me something. He said, with your handicap and your speech defect, you have to listen very carefully. And it works. Thank you for coming.
Those who are really interested, we'll be here tomorrow night. We'll be really looking at the Capella Minneapolis program in greater depth, and we're going to also shift and look a little bit about the DAPT problem solving model.